Thank you for that lovely introduction, Mark. I appreciate it. And welcome to everyone who's not actually here, right? We live in the future, as my husband says, and so people can be here and not at the same time, which is fascinating and awesome to me, but also perplexing. But thank you so much for coming tonight, for hearing this, what I call my own TED Talk, my first Tuesday lecture, which I've called Calling BS, How to Win the Misinformation War. And part of the reason I wanted to do this is, one, because it's in my wheelhouse, but also because, you know, given the context of the last 6 days, right, the war in Ukraine and Russia, it's really timely to know, like, what we're seeing and what's true and what isn't, right? And we lived in this past year, we've seen a lot of fake news and all of this business coming in, and I thought, well, what can a person like me do? Right? And one of the things I can do is this stuff, talk about how to make good media choices, right? Call BS on some of the stuff that you see. And there's lots of ways to do this. Certainly, there's a lot of tricks that I have and other people have, but there's also lots of other ways we can do this. But I think this is a way that I use when I look at news media, because I am not immune to looking at all this news and trying to decide, is it real or not? So one of the things I wanted to talk about is misinformation versus fake news versus disinformation, okay? Because all of these terms kind of come together and we hear them, right? How many of us have heard misinformation, disinformation, and fake news? We've all heard it in various contexts. But misinformation is not necessarily the same thing as fake news or disinformation, right? So as I have up here, misinformation is designed to mislead for whatever reason. It is not, oops, I goofed, I got the source wrong. That's not misinformation, right? If it's in a good faith effort. So sometimes you see corrections or stuff. That's not misinformation. That's just, whoops, we made a mistake, or it was misattributed. Fake news has come to mean anything somebody doesn't like, right? And I'm guilty of this too. I'm like, oh, that was fake news, right? I didn't like what they said. That's not really a good thing to be thinking, but it's also misinformation. So disinformation is maybe not correct, but not necessarily deliberately so, right? Remember 2 years ago now, at the start of the pandemic, everyone said, don't wear masks. Or wear cloth masks, or make them. Well, that wasn't misinformation. They didn't deliberately mislead you, right? But now we know that that's not true. Science changes. So it's good to know, where are we in this before we get going? All right, how many of you have heard media bias and the bias chart? This is a chart, and none of us in this field like it. But it's something useful. So one of the things that I hear a lot, and I'm hearing it increasingly, I think, maybe just because I'm paying attention, but I'm hearing a lot of things, both on the radio, from my students, from people I know, that say, I can't just watch the news anymore, or look at Instagram, or all of this. All the news is biased. They all have a spin. I don't know what to think. And I go, well, some of it is, yeah, but not all of it is. And this bias chart, you know, they update it occasionally, and it's not a very good design. You kind of use it to make your judgment if you need to. You know, the most extreme are at the ends, right? And you want to aim for center. But I don't like to use this chart, partially because it is, in some sense, misleading. It's not disinformation or misinformation, but it's a little misleading because, one, we are all biased unless we are robots. And if you are, that's really cool. But we're not robots, right? And even scientists often have some bias in what they do. They have the scientific method, right, to get out of that. But the questions that they ask or the experiments that they do are not perfect. And they admit it. But there's a big difference between, say, a good source in the middle, BBC, or, for instance, AP News or PBS. There's a big difference between, say, an opinion or a letter to the editor and the same outlet. So You have to be careful of that. So just because you could come to me and say, hey, I'm starting in a good spot. I got that information from CNN. Or I got that from the Wall Street Journal, and it was great, and I learned a lot. I'll be like, great. But that doesn't mean, that that's necessarily true. Unless you got it from an opinion page or something, and then that's somebody's opinion, and they may be an expert, and they may be qualified to speak, but it is not the same thing as something. For instance, Fox News, right? Your local stations are different than the Fox News that gets in lawsuits all the time, correct? Like, those are different things. So you have to be careful by just lumping everything into this media bias chart, or this bias, right? So just keep that in mind as you're listening to the radio or watching it. Where is it coming from? And in the rest of this, I'm going to kind of go over what you can do. So what can you do? If you see this, you're not really sure, maybe you've looked at this chart, maybe you want to look at this chart and just see where your favorite media comes, and you go, oh, wow, okay, it's in the middle, what do I do? I'm here for you. So my background, as Dr. Lansing said, is in something called rhetoric. And basically what that is we look at how something does what it does. So the formal definition up here is rhetoric refers to the study and uses of written, spoken, and visual language. And we analyze how language is used to do those things. So it's not just, oh, that's a poem, that's a film, this is a news clip, this is an editorial. We absolutely look at those things. But we look at how it does those things to create knowledge, produce change, incite behavior, right? So if I keep saying something and over again, I can make you believe something's true even if it's not true, right? We look at how those things work together, identities, meanings, and create knowledge. So it's not, we're not looking at what something says all the time. We're looking at what it says, but what it says in a context, how it says what it says. So we use a lot of strategies, many more that I'm going to be able to go over tonight, and probably many more than even I know about, honestly. And we look at that. So it's kind of one of these soft skills that people talk about when they say, like, oh, English people, they can communicate. We can. And we have a lot of skills. And one of the things we're good at is doing this. And it's really important, right, to understand how a news story can produce change or create knowledge or maintain a social group, okay? So when we refer to rhetoric, at least in this presentation, that's what we're referring to. So what does that mean? When I use rhetoric, what does that mean? Well, and I'm going to get to that in a minute when I get to this pretty slide up here. But rhetoric just means asking good questions, using those things. And in a minute, I'm going to go over what I mean by that, what kinds of questions I look at. But if I'm starting with something, if I'm starting with a news story, and I want to know if it's any good, if I go back to my media bias chart, let's say I've got something from PBS. I hear a story, and I go, I want to see if it's any good. And I go, well, it's in the middle, so it's probably okay. They probably don't have an agenda, and it wasn't an opinion piece. I'm going to look, and I'm going to use my rhetorical skills to do this. I'm going to do what's called triangulation. And triangulation is not, like Aristotle, or it's not geometry or trigonometry. But can we find this information in at least 3 different places? Right? So some of you may know the rhetorical triangle. That's a different triangle in terms of rhetoric. We like shapes. But can I find this? Can I corroborate this information in probably 3 places? And it doesn't have to be exact, right? So if I hear something on PBS and then I do a quick Google search and I find it from US News and World Report and my Fox News station, I can go, okay, that's pretty good, right? So that's where I might use that. But what do I do once I have that? Does that mean it's true? Does that mean it's not necessarily something I can report? Maybe. It could be, and it probably is. But because I can't leave well enough alone, and English professors are good at analyzing almost anything, I'm not quite done yet. I want to look at 3 places, and I want to check it off, and I want to ask myself some questions. Okay. The biggest questions that I always ask are these four, generally. And there are many, many more questions you could ask. If you're interested in that, see me after this. But basically, I want to ask four main questions. The first one, genre, that's easy. What kind of text is it? Is it a news story? Is it a tweet? Is it an image? Is it a song? Is it a quote from somebody? Is it an academic journal? What is it? Because that tells me, kind of gives me a roadmap of how I'm going to understand that, right? Like a tweet is only how many characters? 128 characters. I'm not going to expect a ton of detail from a tweet when I would if I'm reading a chapter in a book, right? It's apples to oranges or apples to blueberries or whatever you want to talk about there. So already, and we know this already, like I don't have to think and go, oh, is that a tweet? Is that a TikTok? I know that. The other thing I look at is context. So context is a big one, and in the text cases that I'm going to look at in a few minutes, you're going to see this. But where was it found? Okay, did I find it online? Was it a radio show? Was it in one of those sources on the media bias chart somewhere? What happened before and after, right? So sometimes, we've heard this before, where something comes out, we hear a story or a scandal or a piece of juicy gossip, and then something else happens, and then the celebrity or the politician or the corporation says, wait, just kidding, we're committed to that. Right? Did that happen right after? Did something happen before? And now all of a sudden we're talking about this. Is it the full story? Was this taken out of context? And we're going to see some examples of this as well. So I want to look at, not just what it is and the type of text, but its context. I also want to look at credibility. And this is one that my students know a lot about, or they think they know a lot about, but we have a lot of conversations about because it's hard, I think, to really understand. But I want to know who wrote it or what wrote it. Like, is it a think tank? Is it an expert on TikTok? Is it, my mom? Whoever it is, what are their credentials, if any? What authority or not do they have to speak? Why are they speaking? Do they provide any kind of evidence or facts? Or any kind of anything? Do they cite their sources? What sources do they have? And then purpose. Why did they write it, and what are its goals? So what is its motivation? And you might say, okay, Dr. Etlinger, I'm with you. But how do you determine the purpose? Isn't that just a guess? Yes, often it is. But sometimes it's not. You can tell. Like if I'm tweeting, right, I'm not going to tweet something with the expectation that I have to defend that. Right? I'm going to tweet 128 characters or however many it is, and I'm going to put that out there. And that's a short nugget. I may follow up on it, but I don't have to go in there and say, hey, here's a source, and here's another source. Twitter is not built for that. But for instance, if I'm, trying to do something else, if I'm trying to convince a student, or if I'm trying to convince my boss to give me a raise, I'm going to have some evidence. Dr. Lanting is going to need pages and pages of evidence as to why I deserve more money, right? I can't just walk in and ask for it and demand it. And that's okay. So if I'm using those things and the evidence and the motivation, you can kind of say, wow, she really wants a raise. She's providing evidence. She's not just dropping the mic and leaving, okay? Aha. So again, when I look at genre, what type of text does it? What does this type of text permit and exclude? As I was saying before, tweets don't allow you to do a lot, right? But they also do allow you to share funny memes and share funny things, and that's great. They allow us to communicate pretty quickly with other people, okay? Whoops. Same thing with credibility. Where was it found? What kind of evidence? Not just evidence, what kind of evidence, right? For credibility here, not just any old, is it crappy evidence? Is the evidence out of date? Is it really, really new and may need some checking? And I'm going to talk about diction and word choice in one of the test cases that I showed you. because sometimes that can lead you to your motivation. When we ask, how do we know the purpose? Sometimes English professors have things up their sleeves and we can tell by certain ways that they've written, okay? And this is the context one. What happened before and after? Is it the full story? Where was it? Something about context that I didn't mention that I want to. A lot of times, we are presented with information as if we already understand it, or as if the assumption is that we're already familiar with stuff. Like, there were people, sometimes I work as a poll watcher or a poll volunteer in my community, and there are many people who vote in every election who are not really sure what happens to their ballot. Right? And that's okay. That's why we're there. We're there to answer questions. Or how do I get a provisional ballot? There's nothing wrong with that. But when we see media that says voter fraud or no evidence of voter fraud or this election was safe, they're guaranteeing or they're banking on the fact that you either know or don't know a lot of questions, right? And so sometimes context is tricky. And here's the big one. Why was it written? Motivation and goals. Okay, so here's a test case. I have 3 cases for you, and some of this I did with my students. So I've kind of warmed up this information. This is a recent article from the New York Times. It was from September 25th, 2021. And it was updated in October. So it's not that old. And when I did this in class, it was like 2 weeks old. Okay, so last semester I did this in class. It wasn't that old. This was right around the time thinking about genre. So we're going to think about genre. Well, it's the New York Times, and it's not the opinion. So it's a story. So I know already, okay, what type of text it is. All right, and I know what it allows me to do. It's not going to be, it's going to have information, and it might have evidence and sources, but it's not going to be super wordy. It's not going to be super long, right? And that's okay. It's got a nice, so I know that. It's got a nice headline. It's got an image right there. So already I kind of know, oh, all right, my attention is grabbed. There's something about purpose, right? Context and purpose. But this was also in terms of when was it happening? This was right around the time that vaccine mandates were coming out in various states. President Biden had, announced them and was getting OSHA involved in all of this stuff, right? And certain states had them, certain states didn't. So this is the headline in the New York Times, which is one of the papers of record in our nation, right? Everyone's heard of the New York Times. These healthcare workers would rather get fired than get vaccinated. Monday is the vaccination deadline for New York State healthcare workers. Thousands of refusers have failed to meet it. And then we get this big photo. If I'm looking at this and I'm clicking on this and I'm just doing a Google search, that's the image that I get. And that's the headline. So my students would be like, that headline's clickbait. Maybe. I mean, headlines are the OG clickbait, right? And it is. But if I look at that and I go, wow, these healthcare workers would rather get fired than get a shot. That's punchy. That's strong language, right? So already I can see by the word choice and by what I know about headlines, what they're going to do, that motivation. They want to tell us something, and they give us a pretty angry crowd, right? Who look like they've got their posters. They look pretty mad. They don't look happy, okay, about this. And the story goes on. My first thought is, oh my gosh, I wonder if this is happening elsewhere. Turns out it was, but I've got more to say in that. So then I have to think about this. My questions are, okay, I know kind of a little bit of this analysis. I've already done some questions, but I've got to triangulate this. I've got to figure out, is this really a thing? Is New York Times doing a feature? Or did they really want me to think this? Is this true? Is this happening everywhere? Like, man, this is pretty scary if it is, or if it's not, I better think about this. And it turns out that when I go to look at my other sources, right, to just go and do a Google search, one of the first things that came up was this. And this was from The Conversation. And it says half of unvaccinated workers say they'd rather quit than get a shot, but real-world data suggests fewer following through. So there's a headline. Now, if we go back, if you look up here, update. As the mandate deadline approached, thousands of resident healthcare workers got vaccinated. But if I'm looking at that in September 26th, I don't know that yet. Okay, so now context matters now, right? Now that it's March 2020, they've got that update. It wasn't disinformation. They've just updated it. But I look here, and it mentions New York. It says at least 125 employees at Indiana University resigned. And then it says, New York, for example, is preparing for an exodus of healthcare workers and may even call the National Guard to help. That sounds pretty scary, doesn't it? Or like a situation, they're prepared. If I'm calling the National Guard, I'm prepared for stuff to go down. But it turns out, it was just strong words. If you actually look, they did some data. They actually said, okay, we looked at this. We did some data of people who said they weren't going to get it and were vaccine hesitant. And the survey, so they said other polls have shown people are mad, okay? It says a Kaiser Family Foundation put the share of workers who would quit, they said they would quit at 50%. That's a lot of workers. But when they did the data, okay, when they looked, they said, but while it's easy and cost-free to tell a pollster you'll quit your job, are you actually going to do it? Turns out, no. So, hospital in Texas required its 25,000 workers to get a vaccine. So that's 25,000, that's a lot, okay? How many quit? 253. 153 workers were fired, and 253 were granted extension. So, okay, 150, 250, that's 400 out of 25,000. That's hardly 50%. That's hardly thousands. That's hardly National Guard issue. And you can look at this data. I just did a Google search. There's lots of it. Oops. There's lots of it. So it doesn't mean, so does the New York Times lie? No. They're reporting on that. But if we go back to this, they want us to be interested in that story and get us fired up. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't know about this, okay? This is not an opinion piece. This is a feature story. But it doesn't mean that everything in it is okay. And they did due diligence. They said thousands of people did this. So you could cite this. You could use this in an essay or something and realize. But you can't just take it at your word because the survey says, and I had lots and lots of data for this, but I didn't want to bore you with all the data. I think the highest number I saw when I was looking for these was 4% of healthcare workers. So not that many. Okay? Here's one that we looked at in my class too. Now this, when we put this to the test, these are numbers, I think from the World Health Bank. These are great. They're tracking all of the numbers across the world of how many coronavirus infections there are. So as of whatever date this was, over 40 million currently infected. Okay? And the numbers are great, right? Because they're updated and they have a really good algorithm and everything like that. But when I look at this, and I found this on a tweet, and I brought it to my students, and I'm bringing it to you. If I look at the top number, okay, sure. Here's the big number. Here's the serious or critical mild condition, 99.8%. Yeah, this isn't so bad. Okay, closed cases. Cases which had an outcome, they circled that recovered, discharged, and they circled, or they left 2% deaths. Well, the numbers are fine, I think. But if I just look at this, It's not telling me the whole story. This is where context comes in. This is where I want to know. Why does a number, you could say, but Dr. Etlinger, the numbers are fine. Absolutely. They probably are as accurate as any numbers. But look at how they're presented. They're presented as if 2%. I just said to you a minute ago that 2%, 4% is fine, right? Case closed. This isn't a serious illness. Almost 5.5 million deaths. That's a lot worldwide. That's a lot. Okay? But also, death isn't just the only outcome here. Some people are still recovering. Some people end up in the hospital. Some people are disabled. And what is mild condition? Right? I know people who had a mild disease, but were still in the hospital. They just didn't die. Right? Or they didn't need an incubator, but they still had to go. And there's all kinds of stories. So I don't want to belabor this point. But this just means that context helps me understand when I have good data, it matters what I do with it. It matters what this tweet, I think it was some kind of economist, I think his handle was woke economist. They want us to think, yeah, this is no big deal. This is overblown. How do I know? I know because I can see what they're drawing my attention to. The design of this tells me that. And I also know where it comes from in the Twitterverse, right? If I'm seeing a lot of tweets like this, this is one of many. Context helps me here. All right, the third test kit, this is my favorite one. So this we looked at in my class as well. And I brought this to this, and one of my students actually brought me this. They said, this is a source I'm finding, and I really want to know, what do we think of it? And I brought it to the class. I said, well, let's talk about it. And you can't see up there because I'm really not very good at screen grabs. But it's called Dr. Sam Bailey. And when I clicked on that, he's a medical doctor, okay? Or she, rather, is a medical doctor. And she's done lots of trials, medical practice for 20 years, has authored numerous publications. You go, wow, that's great. They certainly have expertise, and they do. And if you look at this website, and there's a lot of blogs there, there's a lot of articles there, you can look for them. They cite their sources. They have evidence. There's a lot of evidence. And as I said, I didn't want to have like 50 slides here that show you all the evidence, but you can look this up. And the evidence, they link to them. You could go click on those pages. That's a really good sign. If I can go click on a page and find that information, that's pretty transparent. And it's a blog, and it's an article, but it's written by an expert. I used to blog, and I think when I would try to be really credible, right? I would try to do a good job at those blogs. So I can't say anything about this. So why wouldn't I want this to be cited? You might say, well, and when I said, let's triangulate this, class, let's go look. And in class, we did. We clicked on some of the links that they had. We checked them out. We corroborated some of the data, and some of the data actually lined up. So I said, well, look at me. Look at this. You found a good source. But then we looked closer. And this is where word choice, and this is where diction, and this is where motivation and my English professor cape came on, and my tricks. You look at the title of this. Omicron and virology's alchemy. Alchemy is a fancy word, and it's an old word, and it was basically used for people who, alchemists were they would make these concoctions, right? They were scientists, but at a time when, we didn't have a real field of science the way we do now, and they would make kind of fool's gold and all these weird potions and things like that. So they were not taken seriously. So if I've got somebody calling virology's alchemy, I, as a scholar and as a savvy reader, give a little pause. I go, what are you trying to accomplish, Dr. Bailey, by calling virology, the study of viruses, as alchemy? By kind of saying these real scientists, this field is maybe just a bunch of BS. So that's the first thing I look. And if I look down at all this stuff, I circled this. You can't see this. But it comes, and this is like pages of this, okay? So it comes down, you can see blue, they've cited sources, they've got doctors and scientists galore that they cite, and you could go to their websites and look. But if you look at the second line here, because of the flawed methodology involving simply detecting genetic sequences in the environment and declaring this constitutes evidence of a virus, that's exactly how they determine this, okay? You have it, you have it. Any work of fiction is possible from these experts. He put it in quotes. Later on, in here, okay? Omicron is their latest update in their virtual reality that is becoming increasingly disconnected from the natural world. Not missing a chance to cash in on Omicron, Richard Hatchett, CEO of the Coalition for Academic Diseases, quotes, and he uses predictions again. My favorite, down here. He's talking about how the pharmaceutical companies, right, are just running a scam because they're a business. They have vaccines in quotes. Vaccines offer no solutions unless the goal is human experimentation with genetic vectors. And the safest way to protect you from Omicron virus, right, is the tyranny that promotes such illusions. Like everything COVID-19, Omicron's capacity to cause disease is limited only by its ability to infect the minds of the susceptible with the fear-based narrative. This does not sound like objective language to me. And it shouldn't to you, because it's not. Because it's not. And if you heard that anywhere, you would think somebody was crazy, right? But they have other sources. It passes some of the tests. It passes almost all the tests. But when you look at the language, when you look at the diction, when you look at how they cite their sources, it's certainly not an objective tone that you would get. I'm going to tell you, I have written a lot of essays. None of them about science. None of them about genetics. But I can tell you that if I were giving an interpretation of a poem or a story, and I called it these experts or these critics or these poems just have an agenda, my English professor would say, you need to come back and cite your sources. You need to come back and give this a real shot. You need to have real evidence for these claims. You can't just give me an opinion and disguise it and dress it up as a scientific paper. So just because somebody has credentials and they're looking like they're doing all of these things, and we took this in class, we took 40 minutes to kind of unpack this in class together. We learned a lot. You can check some of this data. Some of this data is great, okay? But how it's explained is not. It shows a lot of the bias. And if you were to do some further research on this group, it's a whole group whose goal, and they stated on their website, is to sow doubt in vaccines in general and the medical community as well. Okay? So that's what we found out when we looked at this. So it even had me for a couple minutes when my student brought this up in class. So that's why I say diction and word choice is important. So obviously, I've only given 3 examples here. And obviously, there are thousands more. And I've hopefully asked a lot of questions or shown you how asking a lot of questions can do this. But a lot of people might say, okay, I don't have time for that. Right? I'm busy. I want to know. What can you do to take control of your media consumption? 1, you can start with good stuff. If I go back, I'm not going to go all the way back to my media bias chart. But if I start with good stuff like CNN, NPR, the New York Times, although be careful, remember the first story with the protesters? If I start there and I can kind of piece together some data, and I look at things like context, I look at who they're asking, what they're saying, is the number any good? Yeah, but where did I find that number? Was that just as a chart somebody posted, right? Was it, here's a fact you need to know on the hallway to class? Or was it on a tweet from somebody? Was it a tweet from me, someone you trust, I hope? Was it a tweet from somebody else who may not be as credible? Okay? Think about that. And think about what their motivation and goals are. You might not get it right all the time. I don't get it right all the time. But at least I'm asking, and at least I'm investigating, and I'm going, okay, what can I do? What might their purpose be? Is their purpose to get me to buy something? Is their purpose to sow doubt? Is their purpose to rile me up? Is their purpose to make me laugh? Or is their purpose really to inform me, right? So when I said that in class, one of my students predictably said, but what about that doctor on TikTok that goes around and debunks all these things? And I said, oh yeah, I've seen her. She was I think, well, there's a lot of them, but one of the ones we were talking about was a nurse on a COVID ward, and she was looking at something and saying, no, this is true. I said, but what's her goal? Her goal is to sow doubt? And she says, no, the goal was to really inform. And I said, then you can probably trust that. You might still want to check some of her facts. You might still want to take it with a grain of salt, but it seems like her goal is, hey, I'm seeing this. I want you to see this too so that you don't do this, or so that you do make sure you're careful, okay? And then you always want to think about context. Where did I find it? Who else has it? Is this good information? Do they have evidence for claims? What evidence is there, and can I go find it? Because I have to do that all the time. And anyone who follows me on Facebook, I pull stories a lot. Sometimes I share things that I think are funny or interesting, and somebody goes, hey, this is old. This wasn't true. And I have to take it down. Okay? So it happens to all of us, but if you start from the good spot, if you start and you think, okay, I can do this in about 5 minutes, 10 minutes, you'll be a lot better consumer of media. Thank you. Yes. So you already know you know this. So that's a great question. Anybody else have any questions? Right. And I think that's a great question. And I think, and some days I'm there too. I think we're all there. I think, it's a hard one. I think my answer would be, that's a really hard question. I mean, but here's the real answer. Most of the time, there's always going to be a few naysayers, right? Who I don't believe everything. Everything's a scam. Everybody's there, right? So I might encourage them to say, well, no, maybe you should go and look and see and be aware of confirmation bias, right? Only confirming what we believe. But at the same time, and I would still encourage them, but I'd also encourage myself to be, maybe this is one of those people that I'm not going to reach. And that sounds terrible. And I don't mean that we shouldn't try and we shouldn't engage with them. Give them good information. Ask them questions. You might ask them, well, why do you think everybody's got a pocket in somebody? Right? The odds of, yeah, conspiracy theories happen, but the odds of no information being good, how would we make any decisions? Right? So I think listening, I think trying to meet them where they are, trying to understand, yeah, I get that you're skeptical. And that's what I said before. A lot of people say, well, all the news is biased. I'm hearing that a lot. And I will say, well, no, if you actually keep checking sources, if I look at something and like 4 or 5 people that I could say have it, chances are, yeah, maybe they're all in cahoots, but it's much more likely that they're not. You can try. I think reasoning is good. I think trying to present good information is all you can do. I do have those students myself. I do have those people that we encounter. And I think you have to be patient. I think you have to try, right, to give them the best information or to ask them questions and get them in the right spot. But ultimately, they have to change their mind or not. I don't know. You can't change their minds for them. It's really hard, though. It breaks my heart every time I don't reach anybody, and I get that. Thank you so much for your questions, for your attention, and thank you online people. If you have questions online or anybody, you can email me at my Rock Valley email address. You can find me. It's on the website, and if you want, I can give it to you. You can email me a question or email me something, and we can talk about it. I'm happy to answer any questions in email. What do they say on the radio? I'll take my answers off the air. I'll take my answers off the air. Take my question off the air.